ever to serve twice as Attorney General of the United States, the first to serve in 2 separate centuries as Attorney General of the United States, William Barr. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rod. I hadn't thought of that accolade, but that, I'll have to work that in. And thank you for your distinguished service at the department for 30 years. And I'm going to take credit for having detected the talent that you have and being partly responsible for bringing you into the department. And I want to thank you especially for your willingness to stay for a time to help me with this transition. I have to say, it's been thoroughly enjoyable working with you. I too would like to thank Richard Toscano and Granette Trent for putting on this important event every year. I'd like to thank the great honor guard from Theodore Roosevelt High School, Dorothy Williams for her wonderful rendition of the national anthem, and Onisha Herring for her leadership as vice chair of the Department's Association of Black Attorneys. And above all, I want to thank all of you for being here to honor Black History Month. Black history is American history. You can't tell one story without telling the other. And this year's theme is Black migrations, which is an important topic for Black history, but as well as for the history of the entire nation. The first Black migration to this country was obviously forced migration. It was the Middle Passage. Over the course of centuries, millions of Africans were taken in chains, branded with hot irons, and packed into small, overcrowded boats for the treacherous journey to this land. And that journey frequently took many weeks and even months. And in these conditions, many died even before they reached the shore. In 1789, in a speech before Parliament, William Wilberforce cited an estimate that 1 in every 8 slaves bound for Jamaica died on the Middle Passage, and that 1/3 died soon after arrival. Slavery, it's often been said, is the nation's original sin. James Madison himself recognized as much in a letter he sent decades after he helped draft the Constitution that codified slavery. Writing in 1820 to his old friend, the Marquis de Lafayette, Madison described the political turmoil that had resulted from the inexcusable tolerance of slavery as, quote, the dreadful fruitfulness of the original sin of the African trade, unquote. And it took the bloodiest war in American history and 3 constitutional amendments to finally end slavery and to give African Americans the freedom to migrate where they chose. Once slavery was finally ended, those who had been enslaved and their descendants migrated again and spread to communities all across the country. For example, there were the exodusters, thousands of African Americans who fled the South for the Great Plains and for homesteads in the West. But the best known of these migrations was, of course, the Great Migration, when millions of African Americans fled persecution in the South to places like Chicago, Detroit, or New York. It's a great book written by a Pulitzer Prize-winning African American writer, Isabel Wilkerson, called The Warmth of Other Suns, and perhaps many of you have read it, but if you haven't, it's a beautiful book which you should read. And it is the history of the Great Migration. And she writes, during the First World War, a silent pilgrimage took its first steps. Over the course of 6 decades, some 6 million Black Southerners left the land of their fathers and fanned out across the country for an uncertain existence. By the time it was over, no northern or western city would be the same. In Chicago alone, the Black population rocketed from 44,000 at the start of the migration to more than 1 million at the end of it. By the turn of the 21st century, Blacks made up 1/3 of the city's residents, with more blacks living in Chicago than in the entire state of Mississippi. The Great Migration changed American history, not just for the migrants, but for all of us. And it made possible the American cultural milestones like the Harlem Renaissance, Chicago Blues, Motown, just to name a few. The migrants included the families of Americans like Richard Wright, astronaut Mae Jemison, HUD secretary and neurosurgeon Dr. Benjamin Carson, and many, many others. Today, we see many African Americans returning to the South. In the 2010 census, a higher percentage of African American population lived in the South than on any census in the past 50 years. And I think this is a good sign of progress. President Lincoln may have signed the Emancipation Proclamation more than 150 years ago, but there's a great deal of work left to do in eradicating prejudice and bringing together the people of this nation. And much of that work falls to the Department of Justice. One of the reasons that this department was created in the first place, in the days after the Civil War, was to help protect the civil rights of African Americans in the South and to fight for the fight against the very same persecution that had triggered the Great Migration. And that is why I pledged at my confirmation hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee that one of my top priorities as Attorney General would be protecting the right to vote. In our present period of great political division, it is imperative that we protect every citizen's right to vote from all who would interfere with it. And that is, of course, one of the reasons the men and women of the Civil Rights Division are so important to our work here at the department. It is an honor for all of us to continue this work of protecting the civil rights of all Americans. And I am grateful to all of our Civil Rights Division attorneys and staff for their work toward this noble end.